My name is Elias Barlow, and what I'm about to share with you is not a dream, not a hallucination, and not something I made up to scare people. This happened to me, body, soul, and spirit. The date was August 3rd, 2009, and I remember like a scar carved into my memory. I died that day. I flatlined in a filthy Tucson motel room after days of vomiting, delirium, and what I later found out was a severe cholera infection caused by drinking contaminated water while homeless. But what happened after my heart stopped is what changed everything. What I saw, what I felt. It's not something any human being should ever have to witness. Yet God allowed me to, and now I understand why. I was an atheist, a loud, aggressive, mocking one. And I'm telling you, hell is real. And I saw the man the world calls Adolf Hitler in a prison of divine judgment. So horrifying that words barely do it justice. I was a wanderer, a drifter, a drunk. I'd lost everything by the time I was 42. My wife had left years ago. My son, Peter, wouldn't return my calls. I cursed the world and cursed God, though I claimed not to believe in him. The irony, huh? If you asked me back then, I'd say religion was a fairy tale for the weak. I used to get drunk and debate pastors just to amuse myself. I didn't care who I hurt. I was angry, empty, and full of pride. That August morning, my body finally gave up. I'd been sick for 2 days, maybe more. I stopped keeping track. I lay curled up on the stained carpet, sweating, trembling, then suddenly nothing. My vision faded like the last flicker of a candle. I felt my chest tighten, my breath stop, and then silence. But I was still there, still thinking, still conscious. What came next defied everything I thought I knew. I floated upward, not as a ghost, not as some vapor, but as me, more real than ever. The motel walls melted away, and I was in what I can only describe as a cosmic void, black, endless, but not empty. There was presence in that darkness, a pulling, a reckoning. Then I heard the voice, not in my ears, but inside my very being. It wasn't harsh, it wasn't loud, but it was final. Elias Barlow, your life has come to judgment. I didn't argue. I didn't protest. In that moment, I knew I was guilty. Everything in me was exposed. My hate, my bitterness, my arrogance, my apathy. I saw flashes. My wife crying, my son begging me to get help, people I mocked, pastors I cursed, even strangers I stepped over on sidewalks like they were trash. Then, in the distance, a light, not soft or warm, but piercing, brilliant. It formed into a massive throne, towering, unapproachable, and on it sat him, Jesus, but not like the paintings, not like the soft-skinned, robe-wearing figure I used to mock in Sunday school stories. No, this was a king. His robe was like molten light. His eyes, like galaxies on fire. I dropped to my knees without thinking. I couldn't stand before him. I couldn't breathe in his presence. Every molecule of my being screamed, unworthy. And yet, he looked at me, not with hate, not with rage, but with truth. And that truth burned worse than any flame. It peeled me open from the inside. You live for yourself, he said. You fed your flesh and ignored your spirit. You mocked what was holy. You led others away from truth. You chose darkness, and now you must see where that path leads. I wanted to speak, to beg, to plead, but I couldn't. What defense did I give? He was right. Every word was true. Then it changed. The throne faded, and I began to descend. Not fall, descend. Slowly, deliberately, like being pulled by gravity I couldn't resist. The light above shrank, and what opened beneath me was more terrifying than I'd ever imagined. Hell, it wasn't a cartoon. No red demons with pitchforks. No comical flames. It was infinite architecture suffering, like a collapsed city floating in space, crumbling, burning, twisting. Each corner filled with pain, real, raw, unending. Screams, not just loud, but layered, like a symphony of agony that never stopped. I was led or pulled to a structure made of glowing, burning cubes stacked like a puzzle from another dimension. They floated in place, humming with power, each one pulsing with fire. I realized they weren't rooms. They were cells, and each held a soul. One cell caught my eye. Its flame was different, blue-white, diamond-hard, yet alive. And inside it, I saw him, Adolf Hitler. I knew it instantly, not just from the face, though it was him, contorted and broken, but from the aura of evil that surrounded him. His cell didn't look like the others. It radiated judgment. The fire didn't consume him. It dissected him, piece by piece, again and again. And yet he never died, never faded. He screamed, not like a man in pain, but like a soul being unmade. Every second, the flame reflected his crimes. I saw images within the fire, Auschwitz, children, executions, gas chambers. His own voice echoed back at him, twisted by the flames, condemning him with every word he once shouted. I turned away, horrified, but I couldn't look away for long. A force held me there. "This is justice," said a voice, the same voice as before. "Every soul will answer." I began to shake. My own cube, was it waiting for me? Was I next? That's when I cried out, "Jesus, please, don't leave me here." And for a moment, silence. Then light, blinding, consuming. Suddenly, I was back, gasping, screaming, in a hospital bed. Nurses shouted. A defibrillator was nearby. The heart monitor beeped wildly. I had come back. The hospital ceiling was blindingly white, and the buzzing overhead light felt like it was drilling into my skull. For a moment, I thought I was still in hell, still suspended in that surreal place of agony and unending judgment. But then I saw the nurses, the machines, the 4 in my arm. I was alive. I had come back. But I wasn't me anymore. The doctors told me I had been dead for over 7 minutes. They didn't understand how I had returned without brain damage. One nurse whispered to another that I came back screaming, and it was true. I had screamed so loud the patients in other rooms heard me. Screamed because the image of Hitler's eternal punishment was still burning behind my eyes like a brand. The medical team called it a miracle. They said most don't come back from what I had. I didn't argue. I didn't tell them what I saw, not at first. Who would believe me? I barely believed myself. But the visions didn't fade. The flames, the cube, the judgment, the voice, the king. I carried it all with me, like ash in my lungs. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard screaming. I saw people twisted in torment, frozen in an agony that was far too personal to be imagined. It wasn't torture like we see in horror movies. It was deeper than the flesh. This pain belonged to the soul. And the most terrifying part was that they chose it. Not directly, but slowly, over years, through pride, through cruelty, through silence. And me, I was this close to staying there forever. I tried to go back to my old life, but nothing fit anymore. I couldn't drink. I couldn't curse. I couldn't even walk down the street without trembling at the sight of people laughing, scrolling their phones, living like there was no eternity. I wanted to grab them by the shoulders and scream, "Wake up! You have no idea what's coming." But I didn't. I stayed silent until the nightmares started. They were relentless. Visions of the cube, not just Hitler anymore. I began to see other souls, politicians, pastors, teenagers, moms, people you'd never expect. One night, I saw a man who looked exactly like me in one of the cubes. He wasn't screaming. He was smiling, a smirk of denial, of pride. And then I woke up in tears, begging Jesus to never let me fall back. That's when I started visiting churches. At first, I walked in the back, quiet, unnoticed. I couldn't explain what I was looking for. Peace, maybe. Answers. Hope. But most of what I found were smiling faces, good coffee, and sermons about success. No fire. No urgency. No warnings. No hell. I started to think maybe I was alone. Maybe no one else had seen what I'd seen. Maybe I'd go insane carrying it alone. And then I met Michael. It happened at a tiny church downtown. A Tuesday night. There were only 5 people in the pews. An old man with a guitar sang a worship song I'd never heard before. Break me to save me. Crush me to raise me. The lyrics hit me like a slap. After the music, a tall black man with scars down his left arm stood up and said he wanted to share a warning from God. I didn't expect much, but as soon as he opened his mouth, my heart stopped. He said, "I died under rubble, and I saw hell. I saw chains. I saw rivers of molten rock. I saw Adolf Hitler being eaten alive by demons. And I saw a celebrity I used to admire dragged away screaming into a fire he thought didn't exist. I stood up in the middle of the sanctuary. My legs were shaking. My mouth was open. I didn't wait. I ran up to him, grabbed him by the arms, and said, 'You saw the cube too, didn't you?' His eyes widened. Then he nodded. We spent hours talking. Just me and him. 2 broken men with eyes scorched by the same vision. His name was Michael Ford, a former gang member, an ex-con, a man who once killed another man in a bar fight and had somehow been released after years of solitary. A man who, like me, had been given a second chance. His story was different, the location, the moment, the reasons, but hell was the same. The hopelessness, the heat that burned the soul instead of the skin, the judgment that felt like a mirror reflecting every choice ever made. And Hitler, yes, Michael had seen him too, but in his vision, Hitler wasn't in a cube. He was chained in an endless chamber where demons fed on his soul. His crimes played over him like film reels. The screams of victims looped in his ears. He tried to speak, but every word turned to ash. Michael said something I'll never forget. Hell is not hell because God is cruel. Hell is hell because we are. We started meeting weekly after that, praying, reading scripture, trying to process what we had seen, trying to figure out what to do with it, because it wasn't just about Hitler or even ourselves. It was about the millions who were sleepwalking toward eternal separation, laughing, dancing, sinning, pretending the world was burning. And they didn't even smell the smoke. And we couldn't stay silent anymore. Michael began speaking at prisons. I started visiting shelters. We told our stories graphic and raw. Some laughed, some cried, some walked out. But a precious few listened. And those few changed everything. Because that's when I realized the truth. You don't have to kill 6 million people to end up in hell. You just have to live like God doesn't exist. I was one of those people. But grace found me. Mercy interrupted me. And now I had a mission. The silence that followed my recovery didn't bring me peace. Though my body had returned to the hospital bed. Though machines beeped and nurses hovered, my mind remained tethered to something deeper, darker. The visions would not leave me. I could still hear the screams and see the flicker of souls bound in flames, most hauntingly the tormented figure of Adolf Hitler, caged in divine judgment. I tried to convince myself that perhaps it had all been a hallucination, the fevered dream of a dying brain. But there was no mistaking the weight of it. I had not merely imagined something. I had been taken somewhere. And just as I tried to convince myself it was over, I heard his voice again. Jesus appeared, not as a blinding force, but as a gentle command within me. He made it clear my journey wasn't done. Before I was returned to the world of the living, I had to see more. What I had witnessed thus far was not the end of hell, but only the edge. What came next would shake me to the core. We descended again, not in body but in soul, passing through some spiritual membrane. There was no sense of falling or flying, only that in an instant the air around me shifted and the darkness became more profound. The atmosphere grew heavier, thicker, as though soaked in despair. I was aware of every breath, yet I wasn't breathing. We entered a space that felt infinitely darker than the previous one. The ground pulsed beneath my feet like living stone, aching with sorrow. There were no flames, no overt tortures. The agony here was silence itself. The souls we saw were not screaming. They were whispering. They weren't restrained by chains, but by something far worse, regret. Each soul was trapped within an orb, like a mirror turned inward. Some clutched books, holy texts, personal journals, letters, but their eyes were hollow, endlessly reviewing every moment they had ignored truth. One man repeated the same phrase again and again. I knew that was his prison. Not that he had failed to believe, but that he had believed too late, when belief could no longer change his fate. I asked Jesus what this place was. He told me these were the ones who had heard the truth, perhaps even preached it, but had never lived it. Their torment wasn't fire, it was knowledge. Knowledge that they had every opportunity to repent, to change, to listen to the Spirit's whisper, and they chose silence. Their agony was knowing what could have been. My chest tightened at the realization. That could have been me. I had heard sermons, brushed off invitations to church, laughed at believers, pretending I was too intelligent to be swayed by religion. But something deep in my conscience had always stirred. I had always known, even faintly, that there was something more, and I had ignored it. Then Jesus allowed me to see Michael again. His face was pale, like mine had been earlier, full of awe and reverence. His journey had intersected with mine again, not by accident, but by design. Though he had already begun to reform his life after prison, he too was brought here to witness, not to be judged. We stood together now as students of divine truth, watching as layers of judgment unfolded before us like pages in a living book. We were shown a structure deeper still, like a vast honeycomb, carved into the spiritual foundations of the earth. Each cell contained a soul, and each punishment fit the sin. There were no cartoonish flames or horned demons. This was divine retribution, surgical and precise. In one cell, a man stood reciting verses about righteousness while his past crimes of abuse played behind him. He could not stop the repetition. Another man was locked in a courtroom, forever defending himself to a jury of demons, forced to confront the lies he once told as a politician. Every word he spoke rebounded as accusation. He argued endlessly, but his guilt was irreversible. And then, once more, we saw Hitler. He had not been removed from torment. On the contrary, his suffering had deepened. He now knelt in what resembled an immense arena, darker than anything I had seen. Around him were shadows, but not monstrous ones. These were the souls of the Holocaust, men, women, children, entire families who had perished in camps, ghettos, and mass graves. They stood like flames, luminous and silent. Hitler trembled beneath them, not because they attacked him, but because he could not withstand being seen. His soul was raw, naked before the truth, and that truth was unbearable. Jesus explained that justice isn't rage. It's perfect, orderly light. Each act, each drop of blood spilled by Hitler's command, each scream he never heard on earth, he now heard in full clarity, and he would hear it forever. He wasn't burning in some lake of fire. He was buried under the crushing awareness of his own evil, exposed under heaven's gaze. That was the true judgment. That was divine justice. I watched Michael fall to his knees. He looked at Jesus, tears streaking down his face, and asked, "Why are you showing us this?" "I've repented. I follow you." Jesus answered him calmly but firmly, "Because many who believe have forgotten the cost, and many who do not believe have never understood the stakes." Then he turned to me. I could barely hold his gaze. I understood now how little I had known of love, justice, or truth, and how close I had come to rejecting all three forever. He pointed toward a glowing bridge that stretched over a canyon of darkness and said, "Walk it, and remember what you saw." As we walked across the bridge, something in us began to burn away, not from pain, but from cleansing. It was as if shame and guilt were being peeled away in layers. By the time we stepped onto the other side, we were not the same men. Lighter, whole, awakened. Jesus looked at me one last time before returning me to my body and said, "When you return, speak plainly. Do not water it down. Tell them the truth, because the time is short." The next thing I knew, alarms were screaming. A nurse shouted. My eyes opened. I was back, broken, weakened, but alive and utterly reborn. I didn't know what day it was anymore. Time didn't seem to follow normal patterns after I came back. Every hour since my return had been coated with a strange mix of urgency and trembling reverence. I had seen hell. I had seen what the justice of God looks like when every wicked act is judged with absolute precision. And more than that, I had seen myself through his eyes, not as I appeared to the world, but as I truly was. And now there was no going back. I couldn't eat. I barely slept. I carried a notebook around and scribbled down everything I remembered. The cube of torment where Hitler's soul twisted in eternal fire. The whispering corridors where forgotten sins echoed through molten walls. The stench of sulfur and regret. I wrote because I had to. I feared forgetting even a single detail. And more than anything, I feared growing numb to it. Michael and I, though we had never met before, eventually did cross paths after a pastor invited us both to speak at Tent Revival outside Dallas. I'll never forget it. When I stepped out of the rental car and saw him standing there, tall, broad-shouldered, quiet but intense, I knew in my spirit that we shared something no words could properly explain. He looked at me like a man who had come back from the front lines of a battlefield, and I knew he saw the same in me. We didn't exchange pleasantries like normal folks. Instead, after the service, we sat down behind the tent and told our stories to each other under the stars. There were long pauses, nods of understanding, tears neither of us were embarrassed to show. We both described the fire, the screams, the hopelessness. We both saw the same things. And more chillingly, we both saw Hitler. Michael had seen that demon-infested corridor again, where Hitler was torn apart and reassembled endlessly, his face a grotesque mass of agony, his sins echoing back at him in every language he once scorned. But Michael had seen something else I hadn't. He'd seen rows of other dictators, warlords, and cruel tyrants. Some we knew from history, others we had never heard of. Souls whose names had never made headlines, but whose cruelty had left scars on the world. That night, I realized that what we'd seen wasn't just about punishment. It was about truth. God's justice doesn't just punish what the world finds offensive. It punishes what God finds offensive. Pride, abuse, betrayal, the taking of innocence. Every lie whispered to gain power. Every murder hidden behind a cause. They were all there. The next morning, Michael and I felt compelled to visit a nearby juvenile detention center where the pastor sometimes ministered. He asked if we'd be willing to share our testimonies. We agreed, though I was trembling inside. How could I tell teenagers, kids barely old enough to understand life. That hell is real. That eternity is not a metaphor. But as I stood before them, the words came out. I didn't give a polished sermon. I simply told them what I saw. The cube, the heat, the judgment, and the mercy. One boy in the back began to cry. Then another, one of them, no older than 16, stood up and shouted, "I don't want to go there." And in that moment, I knew this pain I carried had a purpose. If even one person turned to Christ because of what I had seen, it was worth it. Every scar on my soul, every sleepless night. Later that evening, Michael pulled me aside. "There's more, brother," he said, his voice hushed. "We weren't just shown hell to warn people. We were shown it because something's coming. A wave, a storm, a global shaking. And many are not ready." He told me about a dream he'd been having ever since his return. A dream where cities burned, not just from war, but from spiritual collapse. Churches emptying. People putting their faith in technology, science, fame, anything but Jesus. He said he saw something called the Tower of Fire, a global system that looked beautiful, advanced, enlightened, but at its core was corruption, spiritual blindness, and rebellion. What unsettled me most was how much it resonated with something I had seen too. Just before I was pulled back into my body, Jesus had allowed me one last vision. I hadn't told anyone yet, not even Michael. I saw people, millions of them, walking calmly toward a beautiful golden gate. They were smiling, holding hands, dressed in fine clothing. But beyond the gate was not heaven. It was another level of deception, a false paradise. And just as they crossed the threshold, the light turned to fire and the screams began. I realized then deception wasn't coming. It was already here. And this was only the beginning. I couldn't sleep that night, not from fear, but from a feeling I can only describe as divine burden. It was like a fire in my chest, the kind that doesn't consume you, but demands your attention every second you're awake. I kept seeing the faces of the boys in that juvenile center, their eyes wide open, their hearts pierced, not by my words, but by the raw truth of what God had let me see. Hell wasn't abstract to me anymore. It wasn't a doctrine or a threat. It was a place, a real place. And so was heaven. So was redemption. And I knew now that every soul, no matter how lost, was standing between those two eternities every single day. Michael and I stayed in touch daily after that night, not out of friendship, though we had become close, but because we both felt a looming urgency neither of us could explain away. It was as if the visions hadn't stopped. Even when we were awake, there were flashes, glimpses in the corners of our eyes, dreams we couldn't shake, people we couldn't get off our minds. We weren't prophets. We weren't pastors. We were just two men God had yanked out of flame for a reason, and we both knew time was short. One night, about 2 weeks later, I was in prayer. Nothing elaborate, just sitting in my living room with the lights off, hands clasped, whispering. That's when it happened again. My chest tightened. The room grew cold, unnaturally so. And then came the shift. I was no longer in my living room. I was standing in a place that looked like Earth but felt completely other. I was in a massive city, towering buildings, blinking lights, crowds of people. But no one saw me. They walked by in silence, staring into translucent devices on their wrists and foreheads. Every single person had something glowing on their skin, symbols pulsing with data and color. I instinctively knew what it was. The mark, but not like a tattoo or barcode. This was digital, neural, invisible to the natural eye, but completely visible in the spirit. The people didn't speak. They didn't even look at one another. It was like they had become part of a network, a system. Their steps were synchronized, their thoughts monitored. I felt the oppression of it all pressing down on me like iron. Then I looked up and saw an enormous tower in the distance, stretching into the clouds. The Tower of Fire, the very thing Michael had dreamed about. Its base was covered in mirrors, reflecting beauty, progress, peace. But its top, it was wrapped in flame. And within the flame, faces, screaming, twisted faces, moved like shadows. Then I heard the voice, not from the tower, but beside me. Many will choose it freely. They will call it light, but it is only fire. I turned and saw him, Jesus, standing beside me in white robes, eyes that saw everything, me, the world, time itself. He wasn't angry. He was grieving. They will not be deceived because it is hidden, he said. They will be deceived because they want it. My knees gave out. I wept right there on the street, invisible to everyone. Jesus placed his hand on my shoulder. The age of warnings is coming to a close. The time of decisions is here. Then I was back, gasping, shaking, drenched in sweat. The clock read 3:33 a.m. I called Michael. He didn't answer right away, but texted me 20 minutes later. You saw it too? We met the next morning and compared what we'd seen. It was identical. The tower, the glowing marks, the silence of the people. But he'd seen something else, something even more sobering. They weren't just people, he told me. Some of them were believers, Christians, churchgoers, worship leaders. I froze. He nodded solemnly. I recognized a few. They weren't evil, but they were silent, and they had the mark. We both sat in silence, understanding without needing to say it. The great deception wasn't about violence or chaos. It was about comfort, about control disguised as unity, a system people would enter willingly, joyfully, even calling it a blessing. We began preparing, not out of paranoia, but obedience. We started fasting, praying daily for hours, memorizing scripture, especially the words of Jesus. We reached out to pastors, but most brushed us off politely, some even mockingly. That's fear-mongering, one said. We're under grace now. Maybe they were right in some theological sense, but I knew what I had seen. I knew where grace ended and apathy began. And I wasn't going to let people sleepwalk into eternal change just because I was too afraid to sound radical. One pastor, however, listened. His name was Gabriel Sanchez, a quiet man who led a small Spanish-speaking congregation on the edge of Houston. He didn't flinch when I told him about the Rubik's Cube of Torment or the digital marks or the Tower of Fire. He simply said, "We've been dreaming the same things." We were stunned. He introduced us to 4 others, believers from different states and denominations, all of whom had similar visions, dreams, encounters. Some had kept quiet for years. Others had tried to warn their churches and been ousted or mocked. But now, we were forming something that felt ordained. We began calling ourselves the Remnant Watchmen, not to build a brand, not to start a movement, but to obey. We started hosting underground gatherings, not just to talk about hell or prophecy, but to prepare, spiritually, mentally, practically. We taught people how to pray with fire, not fluff, how to recognize deception, how to test every spirit. Even the ones quoting scripture. We taught fasting, resisting temptation, and how to stay grounded when persecution comes. Because it will come, and it did. 2 months later, one of our meetings was raided by local authorities, not for anything illegal, but because someone accused us of hate speech. They said we were inciting fear. When the officers arrived, one of them looked me dead in the eyes and said, "This isn't about crime. This is about keeping peace." That phrase chilled me. Keeping peace. That's exactly what the people chasing comfort wanted. Peace without truth. Unity without conviction. And they would gladly silence those who disturbed that illusion. We didn't fight. We scattered. But we didn't stop. If anything, it spread faster. People started reaching out from Canada, Brazil, South Korea, South Africa, asking if the visions were real, asking how to prepare, asking about the cube, the fire, the false light. Somehow, word had gotten out. The watchmen were awake, and we knew the 6th part of this journey was approaching. The world didn't erupt overnight. It slowly bent. That's what shook me the most. There was no siren, no broadcast announcement from a shadowy elite. There was only a quiet shift, like the sun setting just a few minutes earlier each evening. You don't notice at first, but then it's night. After the raid on the house church, the ones who remained scattered. We didn't fall apart, we adapted. We became harder to find, but more tightly bound. We didn't stop meeting. We met in broken barns, in abandoned subway tunnels, in deep woods where even birds fell silent when we prayed. We stopped live streaming and started living by faith. We stopped quoting verses and started memorizing entire chapters. We no longer waited for Sunday, we walked in Sabbath. But even in the silence, we could feel something tightening, a groan in the spirit realm, like the earth itself was bracing for something. That's when the murmurs began. Dreams, warnings, words repeated in tongues from people who never spoke that way before. Children saw fire. Old men awoke with terror in their eyes. One woman who had never heard of Revelation drew pictures of dragons and angels with bleeding swords. Then came the rollout. It didn't call itself the Mark. Of course not. It had a polished name, Guardian, a sleek biometric chip that promised total integration. Digital wallets, medical history, personal ID, AI synchronization. You'll never lose your keys again. The advertisements promised. You'll never forget a password. Overnight, celebrities endorsed it. Pastors blessed it. Banks mandated it. Schools encouraged it. Within a week, Over 20 million people worldwide were wearing it with pride. I watched in horror as entire congregations lined up to be scanned, laughing, rejoicing. The convenience was intoxicating. The deception was perfect. It didn't deny God. It simply made him unnecessary. That was the line. A few of us met again. Michael, Pastor Gabriel, a handful of others who hadn't bent the knee. There was no time left for guessing. We knew this was it, the final stretch. What we had seen in hell was not just a warning, it was a preview. The system was being set. The line was being drawn. We began to train the faithful, not for war, but for survival, for witness, for holiness. We taught people how to live without being seen, how to grow food, how to pray in the Spirit, how to hear God's voice when Wi-Fi and comfort were gone. We gave them flash drives with Bibles, books of underground hymns, instructions for coded communication, and we warned them, they will come, but you must not be afraid. And then the dream came again, this time more vivid, more urgent. I was standing on a wind-swept hill at dusk, looking over a city bathed in cold, artificial light. The tower, the one from my earlier vision, was cracked, its glass shattered. Below it, streets were filled with flickering screens and hollow-eyed crowds. But behind me there was something else, a multitude, men and women barefoot, bloodied, but burning with light, not light from the world, a fire from within. They weren't the strong or the wealthy. They were the forgotten ones, the abused, the ex-addicts, the grandmothers, the runaways, the ones who once sat in the back of churches unnoticed. But now they shined. They stood with faces set like flint, eyes full of tears and fire. In their hands were no weapons, but the word etched in their hearts. And then I saw him, Jesus, descending with a voice like thunder, not a whispering rabbi, but a roaring king. The time of parables was over. Now came justice. And as he pointed forward, he spoke just one command: gather them. I awoke with the weight of eternity on my chest. Michael called me minutes later. He'd seen the same vision. So had Gabriel. Others too, across the country, across continents. The remnant was being summoned, not to fight with fists, but with truth, not to destroy, but to deliver, not to run, but to rise. That was the final message. The storm was here, but so was the light. And now I give this to you. You are not watching this by accident. You were meant to hear this. The story you just heard, my story, is not just about me. It's a warning, a sign, a trumpet blast in the dark. If you felt a tug in your spirit, the stirring in your heart, the whisper that maybe this world is lying to you, it's not your imagination. It's Jesus, and he's calling you. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be willing. Repent. Seek him while there is still time. And don't go alone. If you're ready to take that first step to say, Jesus, I want truth over comfort, I invite you to go down the comment section right now and type, I choose truth. That one sentence may change your life forever. And if you've already chosen truth, type it anyway. Let others see it. Let them know they're not alone. We are the remnant, and our time is now. Jesus is coming. Don't wait.